must go here. The U.S. has been extremely reluctant to participate in the International Court of Justice. It has to agree to be heard, and then it has to agree to carry out whatever the responsibility is. I put the date 1988 because this was a time that the U.S. did get involved in the International Court of Justice. The U.S. was mining the harbors of Nicaragua and was supporting the Contras. And Nicaragua said to the International Court, this isn't right. We are not a country that should be mined by another country. The U.S. was extremely reluctant to go into it because in any face of law we were doing the wrong thing, and in the end we decided not to listen to it, but the embarrassment of being taken to the International Court was enough to change to some extent the U.S. policy. In terms of issues at the moment, one looks at questions of the China Sea, where Vietnam and China are disputing over territories. There's an international dispute over islands between Japan and China, and there are territories in the Himalayas where India and China have ongoing disputes. None of these needs to have a war fought over it. There are treaties and obligations that historians could sit down and work them out. So it's there, it has been used, it could be used more, but ultimately it can't impose itself because of this notion of sovereignty. Other works in progress that have to do with this notion of respect for international law have to do with a whole series of things that have been created. Here I think looking back over the 60 years has been quite striking to see decisions made. We need something that can do this. I pulled a couple of those agencies out. Perhaps the most important is the International Atomic Energy Agency. This was set up once it was clear that the genie was out of the bottle. Atomic power was loose, and atomic power can make enormously dangerous weapons. So the IAEA has played a central part in trying to reduce the expansion of countries that have nuclear weapons. There's the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which has worked fairly well. It took a while for us to realize every time a nuclear device exploded, we're polluting the air and endangering ourselves. Let's not do it. And since that time, these external test bans have held place. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, this has been an effort to keep down the number of countries that have nuclear weapons. There have been violations. There have also been countries that said, we will give up our nuclear program, nuclear weapon program. In that regard, I mentioned South Africa, Libya, the Ukraine. These were all countries that, in a sense, could have developed nuclear weapons and chose not to do or gave them up. There have been violations. Israel, Pakistan, India, North Korea, and what do you do with countries that go ahead and do develop nuclear weapons, but the group that is there inspecting and offering a way in which these can be kept under control is the IAEA. The very debates that have been going on a month ago between John Kerry and the Iranian secretary over Iran's nuclear weapons program or nuclear program indicates how central the IAEA is to maintaining some sort of control here. It was 3 years ago, 2 years ago, that another organization surged into prominence. This was the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. The notion that in World War I, mustard gas was used, nerve gas was used, and countries decided these are horrible, and let us make it illegal to be done. And somebody had to implement it, and this was set up after World War II. And when there was the appearance of chemical weapons being used in Syria, it was this organization that made it possible for that to be brought to a halt, and within pretty much the prescribed time, the chemical weapons were removed and destroyed. So these are things that are working quietly to deal with the notion of international responsibility. I mentioned conventions because here's a whole arena. It's not international law, but these are agreements that countries make that we shall do this. I pulled out the Convention on Refugees, Convention on Children, Convention on Disabilities, Convention on Torture, on Cruel and Degrading Punishment, Discrimination against Women. These are conventions that countries make saying, let us decide what we want to do here, and then we will sign on to them, and when enough nations ratify them, these then become sort of an international custom. Ironically, the U.S. has been unwilling to sign a number of these conventions, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. But these are things that have emerged in the last 50 years as people have said, why don't we decide what should be really not allowed in terms of slavery or torture or cruel punishment? In the same area, the third of the areas we're talking about is the reaffirmation of fundamental human rights. And here's where John Nichols' quote from Eleanor Roosevelt is so appropriate. Probably, and this is Joe Elder speaking, therefore be careful, this is probably the most significant intellectual development in the last 60 years in terms of how we have set up a world that can move forward if we want it to move forward. What are human rights? They're not spelled out in the Charter. We had to develop a concept of what they were. So in 1948, there was a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that's an enormously interesting document. Eleanor Roosevelt, in the biography, describes how she worked out the quite different context of what human rights were, and the major differences between the human rights in the U.S. and Britain, and the concept of human rights in the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc. What emerged was a fascinating document. If you take Articles 1 to 21 and 27 to 30, these look like they could have been written by Thomas Jefferson or Tom Paine or any of the sort of American civil leaders. These are the rights of life, liberty, security, equal protection, presumed innocence, privacy, movement, marriage, property, religion, opinions, association, and participation in the government. These are almost literally taken from the history of the United States and the West. And in order to say we are serious about this, in 1966 there was a civil covenant which said we will do something about this. And the civil covenant picked up the notion of the immediate obligation to implement these. But if you were a nation and you signed the civil covenant, you were saying, at this point, we are going to insist that people in our country have the right to life, liberty, security, and all those. A very clear statement of something which we in the West are familiar with. Articles 20 to 27 are very different. And as you go through the articles, you realize there's another hand on the pen here. These are economic rights, that you have a right to a certain amount of income, a certain amount of health, a certain amount of food. And when you look at them in details, these are the right to Social Security, the right to work, the right to equal pay, the right to leisure, the right to form and join unions. I'll pause for a moment, we are in Wisconsin. The right to education, and the right to adequate health and well-being. Those weren't in the U.S. Constitution. These are the ideas that come sort of from the Marx and Lenin, and the whole notion that economics play a central role in our rights, and that we, as a world with wealth that we can distribute to some extent as we like, we should make guarantees that certain people will benefit from that. So in 1966 there was the Economic Covenant. This was nations saying, okay, we will try to implement these provisions just as well. But look at the timing, where the Civil Covenant said you have an immediate obligation to implement. With the economic rights, it was take steps for full realization. Much more casual, much more, in a sense, unconvincing, but still there in the notion that people should work in this direction, but an idea that we are not nowhere near as easy to implement these as it is for the civil rights. Okay, that's defining it. And when one looks at the effort to define these, it's a very impressive process. How about implementing these? The covenants up until now were essentially voluntary. And here we get into quite recent history. It wasn't until 1998 that the Rome Statute was passed. And this defined genocide. Up until then, there wasn't anything you sort of take into court and say, this is evidence of genocide. But the Rome Statute said genocide is to be defined this way, crimes against humanity are to be defined that way, war crimes are to be defined in this way, and crimes of aggression, and that was difficult to define. So it still remains a little bit undefined what is aggression. But the notion that these can be operational, you can bring a person to trial, you can say, did this person commit a war crime? And if so, do you have the authority to punish them for what they have done? A major step forward in this notion of evolution. This took effect following the tragedies of Rwanda and Yugoslavia, where the world looked at what was happening to innocent people being killed and say, we aren't going to allow another Holocaust to happen. People must be accountable for what they do. So there were ad hoc tribunals set up under the authority of the UN for the crimes in Rwanda and the crimes in Yugoslavia. And at the end of the series of hearings, 45 Serbs, 12 Croats, four Bosniaks were indicted of war crimes or crimes of genocide, and they were punished for it. The beginning of kind of an international court system where people can be tried, they can defend themselves, they can be presumed to be innocent until guilty, and then if they are found to be guilty, they will serve prison time. Probably the most striking person to be imprisoned or be tried was Radovan Karadzic, the president of the Serbians. He was under trial and died before it was completed. But here was, in a sense, a major war criminal who was brought to trial and would almost certainly have been found guilty if he didn't live until if he hadn't died before. Then there are the special courts that have been set up. Again, the notion that these are crimes have been committed now that we know how to define them. Special courts for Sierra Leone, Lebanon, Cambodia, and East Timor. And probably the most dramatic figure there, who's now serving prison time, is Charles Taylor, who's the president of Liberia. He is serving a 50-year sentence for war crimes in the Sierra Leone Civil War. At the moment, there are 10 people being held in prison in The Hague as their trials are proceeding. So this is a case where over 60 years, something that seemed almost impossible to identify. This person is an international criminal. They can be arrested, they can be tried, they can defend themselves, and if they're found guilty, they can serve prison time. Ironically, that having established the Rome Statute, several of the countries that signed it have backed away from it. The three include the United States, Israel, and the Sudan. And this could be a discussion itself. Why has the U.S. and Israel and the Sudan both unsigned the Rome Statute? The notion that they might be charged with crimes of this sort, and therefore they did not want to indicate that they were willing to enforce it on others. Then another recent development, 2002, the International Criminal Court. This is established, again, through the UN process. And there are various ways in which crimes can be identified. And under these systems, you don't have the ad hoc tribunals, which you had in Rwanda, Yugoslavia. You have an established court with judges, with lawyers to defend people who need to be defended. And you have a case where people now can be taken to the International Criminal Court with the procedures being in place. In the current context of people being concerned, what should we do about Bashar al-Assad, or what should we do about al-Baghdadi and the Islamic State? If one sees what's happening in terms of these maybe committing crimes which could be tried in the International Criminal Court, the issue of how one addresses the problem takes a somewhat different color. You don't simply have to bomb people. The courts can take care of the kind of punishment that they may have to stand. And now we come perhaps to the most complicated of the issues in the UN Charter, the saving succeeding generation from the scourge of war. The Charter itself has Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. Chapter 6 says the major task of the UN is the peaceful settlement of disputes, and they go through the whole series of negotiations, inquiry, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, resort to regional agencies or arrangements. So the idea is the UN's responsibility is when difficulties emerge, they should be, if possible, settled through peaceful approaches. Here is where a number of failures have occurred. Perhaps the most dramatic was the Srebrenica massacre in 1995. In 1995, Yugoslavia had come unstuck, and there were wars going on between Serbs, who were Christians, and the Bosnians, who were Muslim. The UN hoped to provide safe sanctuary for the civilians who were trapped, and so the effort was to set up a safe area and to announce to the Serbs and the Bosnians that if people were in those areas, they could not be attacked. This was a case where the UN had exceeded whatever it could enforce. The protection disappeared. The result was that 8,000 Bosnians died. And that is one of those problems that the UN will look back on and say, we would have liked to have done it, we'd like to have safe zones, but until some future date, we have no way of imposing it because we don't have the necessary background. That's probably the most severe failure in terms of dealing with the process of peaceful settlement of disputes. In terms of successes, there are a long string of cases where the UN has played a critical role in bringing an end to war. I pick simply two of them. The Iraq-Iran war, which was devastating on both Iran and Iraq and lasted for about 8 years. Give or take, 500,000 young men died if you added all the Iraqis and the Iranians. And a very difficult war was brought to an end with the UN negotiators bringing these two countries together. The other major peace treaty that was worked out was ending the Soviet-Afghan War in 1989. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The war, again, was extremely costly on Afghans mostly, but a lot of members of the Soviet Union. And then the peace treaty was drawn again with significant UN roles in how you bring this out. Chapter 7 deals with, in a sense, the ultimate crush for the UN. What do you do if there are acts of aggression? Up as far as you can, you find peaceful settlements, you negotiate, you bargain. But what if there has actually been invasion? And it makes it, the UN has made it very clear that the right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against it, and it's the responsibility of the Security Council to take such action as it deems necessary to restore international peace and security. So here we have a crisis. The country has invaded another country, the war is on. What should the UN do? Twice the article, Chapter 7, has been brought into case. One was in Korea, where South Korea appealed to the UN because it was invaded by North Korea. That was in 1950. And then in 1990, Kuwait appealed to the United Nations because Iraq had invaded it. And so to the extent that the charter laid out what should be done, the call was that a country had the right to call upon neighboring countries to protect itself from an outside invasion. Now we look at a number of things that weren't actually built into the UN Charter. One of these had to do with the fact that the UN Charter said nothing about civil war. It spoke about aggression, country A crossing a border into country B. But that and the difficulty of non-governmental actors, which has emerged on the scene, again, raised alternatives that weren't there back in 1945 when the UN was setting things up. What can be said about the scourge of war in the 21st century? And here, I'm going to look at 4 places where the wars have been going on. And here I think we come at a very serious concern about what is happening and where the UN fits. Start with Afghanistan. The U.S. went into Afghanistan in 2001. And the UN in this case lent support actually for the U.S. invasion. It provided the International Security Assistance Force, which is essentially NATO, saying that we are going to enable more foreign troops to go into Afghanistan. And it followed that up with the UN assistance mission to Afghanistan to provide material aid, food, and health to the people of Afghanistan. So in this particular situation, the UN was kind of on the side of, ironically, the invaders. And this has put the UN in a particularly awkward position, because as the war